First, just a few words on the center that I'm directing, the CLEAR Center, which I believe has done quite a service to us in animal agriculture because of two things. The one is the research that we do on important topics. The second one is our ability to communicate that research in ways that important folks, high school kids and college kids, but also journalists, politicians, and so understand. So the CLEAR Center has two cores. The one is in research, the other one in extension/communication. And we have been running that center for 2.5 years now. We're doing a lot of research on things such as greenhouse gases, how to reach a point of what's called climate neutrality, on biomethane, on other air pollutants, water pollutants, and so forth. We are studying how feed additives can reduce environmental pollutants, greenhouse gas quantification on farms. We are studying the worker issue. A very important part of sustainability is really to figure out how to attract and retain a qualified workforce and keep them safe. And then most recently, there had been quite a hype around plant-based alternatives to meat. And many people asked me, Frank, is that true that these things are better for the environment, that they're better for human health and so on? And so we did quite some work on it, and it yielded quite surprising results. Our communication/extension is another very important part of the center. We want to be a clearinghouse pretty much for all kinds of information around sustainability issues of livestock. And we have many news agencies contact us, come and visit and film us, interview us, and write articles about the work we do. But also, we are oftentimes very interactive with the media and bounce off our views of what they write or what they film. We do want to inform the consumers because rather than interacting with a bunch of extremists and activists, and that's not what I'm here to do, my job, I think, is to inform the public at large, most of whom do appreciate animal source foods and want to know how it's produced. And they are interested in sustainability issues around food. They're interested in things such as animal welfare, the environmental impact of food production, food safety. They're interested in the workforce. They're interested in the safety of the food that we produce and so forth. And so for all of those, we are here to be a sounding board. We also work with companies, with organizations, with NGOs, with farmers, to share our research and explain that in ways people understand. Because believe it or not, many scientists, while doing great work, getting out peer-reviewed scientific journal articles, are not spending enough time communicating those findings with the public. And I think that this is really a niche that we are particularly good at filling. The CLEAR Center uses different forms of communication. Here are just a few. We have a website, clear.ucdavis.edu. It's a really good, I think, really good platform explaining all different kinds of sustainability issues. We are producing explainers. We are producing social media content on Twitter. I am on Twitter. GHG Guru is my handle. We're writing white papers like this one here, Path to Climate Neutrality. A pathway to climate neutrality. We're doing YouTube videos and so on. I'm giving many presentations in person. And during COVID, of course, a lot of that went virtual, but it seems like I'm back on the road again. And so 100, 150 annual talks are not unusual for me to present at various meetings. So we have seen over the years that the narrative that seemed to have been so ingrained and set in stone can change. You might remember that years ago, for those of you who are a little higher in the tooth, that we were told not to eat eggs, not to eat bacon, because it's bad for us, because of the cholesterol in there causing cardiovascular issues and so forth. My father was told by his physicians, don't eat eggs. And then the same outlets a few years later totally changed. Now they say, eat butter. Okay. The reason why I bring this up is because I have seen this over and over and over again, that there has been a hype, and that hype had run a couple of years, and in some cases devastated entire sectors. And then new research came out that said it ain't so. And so we want to protect our sector from running those issues or into those issues again. And I think on the climate side, you will see that it's likely for it to happen again, and to happen again as we speak. You see a lot of really negative reporting about animal source foods in various news outlets. Here are some of the examples. Many of the examples of negative reporting circle around the impact of livestock on climate. And here, ruminant livestock is much more in the crosshair compared to monogastric animals, but monogastric animals are not shielded from it. Why are these things written? They are written because there's an interest in the public as to where food is coming from and how it's produced. And not just how it's produced, but how it could be prepared to be a yummy meal, how it should be eaten, eat slow, enjoy, don't rush, don't gulp it down, don't waste it. 40% of all food we produce in this country, 40% of all food we produce gets wasted or is wasted. So that's certainly something that is very much on consumers' minds. And then all the other externalities, such as how about welfare, animal welfare? How about worker welfare? How about, the list goes on and on. So people are interested, and the journalists pick up on that, and then they write stories. And many, many times, these stories are not well balanced, but they are quite biased indeed. And in many of those cases where those news outlets are influential, we do write responses to it at the Clear Center. Oftentimes the responses we write, the blogs, for example, we write, have a greater hit rate with respect to people reading it than the original articles. And I find that quite interesting. I'm not telling you that to make you feel good, even though I do want to make you feel good. I do feel that American farmers are changing the narrative, and they're doing it in a drastic way. We are making real gains, and I'm proud of your sector in particular, and the We Care initiative that you're running, because that is precisely what the public at large wants to know, that you care about the animals you raise, that you care about the consumers and their needs, that you care about the product quality, that you care about the people who work with you. In other words, that you care about sustainability, because that is precisely what sustainability is. Just a few statistics really quickly. Since 1960, the pork industry has really made changes to its environmental footprint, using 75% less land, 25% less water, 7% less energy, 8% less carbon emissions, leading to warming. And they have set goals for the future to reduce further emissions, and that's greenhouse gas emissions, by 40%. And that is no small feat. This is a very significant goal that the pork industry has set for the future. Now, those critics of yours don't really want to hear any of this, okay? They seem to be not interested in it. And they seem to be saying these reduction goals and so on are nothing but greenwashing and creative accounting and so on. I think you're proving them wrong. You are showing with verification and validation of what you have achieved that they are wrong, and that you are on the correct path. These numbers here are all in the peer-reviewed literature, in the scientific literature, and they should really make you be very proud of what you have achieved. But that's not to say that we rest here. We will continue our journey, because sustainability is never a goal, it is a journey. What do I think are the pillars on which sustainability rests? What makes up sustainability? Well, the environment is one. The workers are another. It's really recruiting a qualified workforce, keeping them on the farms, and making sure those workers are safe. Animal welfare, animal health, very important pillar. Food safety, financial viability. So in my opinion, these 5 are the pillars. Again, the environment, workers, animal welfare, food safety, and financial viability. Now, for those of you who still kind of twitch when they hear the word sustainability, for those of you who don't like that term, well, guess what? This term is really not that different to the term stewardship. And I don't think that many farmers have a beef with the term stewardship. Who doesn't want to be the best steward of the land and the natural resources? Who does not want to be the best steward of their animals, the best steward of the people working with them, the best steward of the quality of the product that you produce, and the best steward of the finances around your farm? So sustainability is a term that's really quite popular along the coastlines of the United States, but stewardship is a term that has been used forever in agriculture, and that is what you're particularly good at, and that is why you should own it. And you should also own the term sustainability, just to make sure that everybody understands and not just some rural communities. So the Clear Center does work around all these topics, except for the last. We don't work on the economics, but other colleagues here at UC Davis do. Really briefly, I will not belabor the greenhouse gases here by long, because we have done a ton of that on our webpage, on all of our social media outlets. But in general, for those of you who are wondering what greenhouse gases do and how they warm the planet, what they do is gases such as CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, they lay a blanket over our atmosphere. And the sun radiates solar beams to the surface of the Earth. Normally, that solar radiation and the related heat would be reflected back into space. But now they're bouncing off and against this blanket of greenhouse gases. And with it, the heat that the sun generates is retained in our atmosphere. And the thicker the blanket becomes, in other words, the more greenhouse gases there are, the more heat we retain. And that is why greenhouse gases contribute to global warming. And now most scientists will say the main contributor to greenhouse gases and global warming is from fossil fuels. That's the burning of oil, coal, and gas, producing CO2. Those people are most critical of animal agriculture say we should pay particular attention to methane. And they argue that that is because of the potency this gas has in trapping heat. And it's true, this gas is potent, but this gas is also very short-lived, and that's very important. I'll get to that in a minute. This slide here is kind of convoluted. It comes from the United Nations FAO, and it shows all the global contributions of livestock and feed to greenhouse gases. You see here, the feed production itself makes up a big chunk of the impact, the carbon footprint impact, the greenhouse gas footprint of livestock. So a good chunk, 40% or so. And then the rest here, that's the livestock themselves. If you now want to see it refined a little bit as to which species contribute the most to greenhouse gases, the number 1 is beef globally. These are global numbers. Number 1 is beef. The number 2 is dairy. And then pigs are relatively less important. And that is simply because they are not ruminants. They don't belch out this gas, this methane gas in particular. But they still produce manure, and that manure produces methane. And methane is really what it's all about. When it comes to livestock and climate, it's not all about, but it's mainly about methane. And so it's really important to understand the subtleties around methane and what methane does to our climate. Now, methane is a potent greenhouse gas, about 28 times more heat trapping than CO2 is per molecule. And that's true. Nitrous oxide, by the way, another greenhouse gas, even more so, much more potent. But what's also different is that methane is not just produced, but methane is also destroyed. And you see it on this global budget here. This is a global methane budget. It shows on the left side various sources of methane, including fossil fuel production and use, agriculture and waste, biomass burning, wetlands, and other natural emissions. All of them amount to a global amount of 558 teragrams of methane. That's how much methane is produced globally. Let's call it 560 teragrams are produced globally. Now, that's where the reporting generally stops, but the reporting shouldn't stop here because methane is not just produced, methane is also destroyed. And you see that on the right side of this graph, where there are sinks, meaning places where methane goes down from, and these two sinks are the atmosphere and the soils. And as you can see, they amount to roughly 550 teragrams. In other words, 560 are produced and 550 are destroyed. That leaves the balance of 10 that we need to work on and reduce. Still a number that's too high, we want to reduce it, but certainly one that's grossly different from just looking at sources. What I'm telling you here is that currently much of the media reports on only the emission sources, leaving out the fact that methane is also destroyed and not in a minor way. You see this large arrow pointing down. The large arrow pointing down is titled with sink from chemical reactions in the atmosphere. And I will not make this a chemistry lecture here, but I briefly want to tell you this. If my fist were a methane molecule, within approximately a decade, it would meet another molecule in the atmosphere called a radical. And this radical kills the methane. After a decade, the methane is gone. Most of the methane is gone and converted back into where it came from. So methane is not just produced, methane is also naturally destroyed. The other greenhouse gases are not. And that makes methane so different, and it makes it a short-lived climate pollutant. It's not in the air for 1,000 years like CO2, but for a little over a decade. Remember, it's not just produced, it's also destroyed. And that makes all the difference when you account for methane's impact on warming. I will contrast one source of greenhouse gases, namely fossil fuels, that's oil, coal, and gas, on the left side of this graph, to the greenhouse gases from livestock on the right side. Start on the left side. So oil, coal, and gas is carbon that was originally plants and animals, such as dinosaurs. They died, decayed, fossilized, accumulated underground until 70 years ago, we extracted that stuff from the ground. We burned it and put it into the atmosphere as CO2, and that CO2 accumulates. It becomes more fossil fuel we burn. That, ladies and gentlemen, is a one-way street of carbon from the ground up into the air. Now we take a look at the livestock side of things, where you have atmospheric CO2, which during photosynthesis makes it into plants. Some of the CO2, some of that carbon stays above ground, but the majority goes below ground into the roots. And from there, the microbes, soil microbes, grab the carbon and absorb it in the soil, a process called soil carbon sequestration. You must have heard about it. Healthy soils can trap approximately 1/3 of all human-caused carbon, okay? And agriculture and forestry are the only two sectors of society that can do that can trap a lot of carbon that was in the air and is now in the soil. If we manage the soils correctly, we trap that carbon in the ground. Now, our animals, whether it's a cow, as depicted on this photo, or a pig, all of these animals that we raise eat plant material, and then the different livestock categories process that livestock feed differently. Ruminants, of course, do produce methane and belch it out. That's depicted here. That methane, however, stays in the atmosphere for about a decade, is then broken down and going back into CO2 where it came from. So on the livestock side, we have a cycle. It's called the biogenic carbon cycle. On the fossil side, we have a one-way street of carbon. Every time we burn fossil carbon, we add new additional carbon to the atmosphere. But on the livestock side, we are not adding new additional carbon as long as our herd sizes remain stable. Now, you are pig producers, and so you'll wonder, well, why is he showing us a cow? Well, first of all, because the cows are the main culprits of methane from livestock. But secondly, because your pigs also eat plant material, and rather than belching that methane out, once their manure hits the pond, the lagoon, or the pit, methane will be formed as well. And so the question is, what can happen once we reduce that methane? What can happen to our climate? Before I go there, I just want to show you the emission inventory for greenhouse gases in the United States from 1990 until pretty much now. And what you see is that the vast majority of greenhouse gases in a country like the United States comes from fossil fuel sources, and that's the salmon color here. What you see in orange is the beef contributions to greenhouse gases, and then in light blue is all the other livestock species in the United States. So you can see, yes, we do produce greenhouse gases. It is true. We know how much, but it is not true what we read in the media nonstop, which is that livestock is a main contributor, one that is rivaling everything else, and that is just simply not accurate. What you see here are the Environmental Protection Agency data for greenhouse gases for all sectors, and I think it's pretty clear here as to how significant or not livestock is with respect to total methane. That's not to say, however, that we should not worry about methane, that we should not care about methane. We should care about it, because when we do reduce methane, we reduce warming. On this slide here, you will see that. So as a just little note here, CO2, once it's in the air, it stays there for 1,000 years. I told you that already, and it accumulates, okay? So if you put CO2 out, then it causes a exponential increase in warming. If you increase a swine herd or cattle herd over 15 years, then that increased herd would produce increased amount of methane, and that would lead to increased amount of warming from that methane. But if you hold two sources, let's say a CO2 source, let's say a power plant producing CO2, if you hold that constant, then even though it's a constant CO2 emissions, you still increase the warming from that CO2. Whereas if you keep your herd sizes stable, let's say your pig herd stable or cattle herd stable, then they put out a stable amount of methane, and that causes a stable amount of warming, no additional warming, which, by the way, is consistent with the Paris Climate Accord. But now comes something interesting. If you reduce CO2 from fossil fuels, then it still causes increasing amounts of warming all the way until you stop burning fossil fuels. So at the time we stop burning oil, coal, and gas, then the climate, our global climate, will no longer increase. It will plateau, but it will not go down. If we decrease CO2, our warming will not decrease. But if we decrease methane, then warming decreases. Okay? This is really important because oftentimes methane is treated as if it were a CO2 on steroids, just a more powerful greenhouse gas. But that's not true because it's short-lived. It behaves differently in the atmosphere. It warms the planet differently, as you can see at those bottom three panels here. And that makes us part of a potential climate solution, because if we manage methane, we manage the climate. And that is a short-term solution that we have at our disposal that others don't. And not just can we do this to be green, but we also can do this to make some additional income happen. Here in California, we have a new law that mandates a 40% reduction of methane, 40, to be achieved by the year 2030. At first, our farmers thought that would never be possible. How in the world? But then the legislature decided to achieve that 40% reduction of methane in partnership with the farming sector. So the legislature financially incentivized reductions of methane. They said if you cover your lagoons, and you see one here on a dairy, this is a commercial dairy in California, the lagoon that used to be open is now covered. If you cover your lagoon, and if you trap the biogas that's generated underneath, and if you then take that biogas, 60% of which is methane, and make it into transportation fuels, then you will receive credits for that. Okay, so first of all, what are the transportation fuels? These are called renewable natural gas. They can go into semi-trucks and to buses, and they will replace diesel. So if you take dairy lagoon water and you cover it, like we do here, it's also sometimes called an anaerobic digester, then the microbes under there produce biogas. The biogas is made into transportation fuel, the RNG, renewable natural gas. And this pathway from dairy biogas to transportation fuel is considered the most carbon negative fuel type there is. And that sounds like a bad thing, but it's a good thing. It means it has the least carbon intensity of all fuel types there are. And that's a good thing. And as a result, the state of California pays farmers the so-called low carbon fuel standard credits. Low carbon fuel standard credits, and they run very high. And they have led to a situation where our dairies are running a gold rush on covering their lagoons. I would say 5 years ago, we might have had 10 working digesters in the state. Now we are close to having 200. In a very few years, we will have, in my opinion, at least half of all manure from California dairies going into covered lagoons, leading to the production of alternative fuels. Right now, it's renewable natural gases, but in the future, it will also be EV, which is electric vehicle fuel. So these pathways are happening right now. And what's really important here is our state is very, very happy with the progress the dairy industry has made, because they have reduced 2 million metric tons of greenhouse gases. And that means their manure management has reduced its methane by 30%. So the goal is 40%, and we are well on our way of achieving that. The news I have for you is that if in a sector like the dairy industry here in the state of California, you achieve a 30 to 40% reduction of methane, then that means you reduce so much heat on the methane side that you are offsetting other greenhouse gases, getting this industry to become climate neutral. And climate neutral means, I'm not saying carbon neutral, I'm saying climate neutral. Climate neutral means that this industry will no longer cause any additional warming to our planet. And if this industry goes even beyond that, then it can sell its carbon credits to other industries. And exactly that is already happening. We now have Shell, BP, BMW, and other companies in the state of California buying credits from farmers, because these farmers can generate the credits and the other industry sectors cannot. So there is a real opportunity in the farming sector, not just in dairies, but in all farming, particularly animal farming sectors, to reduce their methane through ways of managing manure, through feed additives and so on, through improved carbon sequestration, to reduce that methane so strongly that these sectors will become climate neutral. Be aware, this is not greenwashing. This is not creative accounting. This is based on sound science and peer-reviewed literature. This is what it looks like when dairy RNG, dairy renewable natural gas, makes its way into transportation semi-trucks that now no longer get diesel, now they get RNG. So to me, a very interesting picture to show. If you want to get an idea as to what our center, the CLEAR Center, has predicted with respect to beef and dairy and them achieving climate neutrality, a green paper I have co-authored with Sarah Place, Dr. Sarah Place, is freely available on the CLEAR Center webpage, as well as a 5-minute short video called Rethinking Methane. It's on YouTube. It's quite popular. I definitely recommend it. And now I want to go back to what it is that we have done over the years to really improve our environmental footprint. There are 4 key factors. We have improved reproduction. I know in the pork sector, and I will show a slide in a minute, reproduction has increased drastically over the last few decades. We have installed a very good veterinary health system to preventing diseases or treating them. We have drastically improved the genetics of both plants and animals in agriculture. And we have learned to feed more energy-dense diets. The combination of those factors have allowed us, or the combination has allowed us to shrink the number of animals needed to produce the amount of food that consumers desire. On the pork side, we had a strong increase in pork production per breeding animal. I think this is something to be really proud of. We have tripled pork production per breeding animal in the United States, and the trajectory continues to go that way. Pigs safe per litter. This is nothing new to you, but I think it's still important in case there are journalists in the audience or so to show how drastic the improvements have been over the years. The US pig industry is the envy of the world. Many other industries throughout the world model theirs after ours. And I think it's really time for our pig industry to be proud of what they have achieved and communicate the achievements in a way that is understood by people that consume your products. Now, you cannot show a graph like that to the general public. They will not understand what it means. You have to explain it in ways the public understands. If you explain what you do on your farm to your next door neighbor, that next door neighbor needs to be able to tell what you told them to their next door neighbor who might not be a farmer, and accurately so. And if they can't, then you haven't done a good job. You need to think about how you explain what you do to people who are not in the farming sector. Okay, it's very important. Farmers have important voices in this entire scheme here, and all too often they are not being heard. And all too often they're not being heard because they don't really want to talk. But I think the time has come where more and more, particularly young farmers, do engage with the public, and I think it's critically important. I want to show you just one comparison here in a second to the US success story. But before I go there, this here is all inputs in the United States in the farming area and all the outputs. What we are doing in this country is nothing short but amazing. We are doing more with similar inputs, okay? Not just more, but drastically more. We are doing exactly what we need to do to satisfy the nutritional needs of the future. Just really quickly, I want to go on a tangent. I'm a little over 50. When I was a little boy, there were 3 billion people in the world. Today, there are close to 8 billion, and by the time I'm an old man, there will be 9 billion people in the world. In other words, throughout my lifetime, human population on this planet will have tripled, 3 times more people on our planet during our lifetimes. And I have to tell you this, we have to think about how we feed those people without depleting all natural resources. The graph that you're looking at here is showing you one way of how that can happen. We see constant inputs and a drastically increasing output. That is what we have to do globally. That doesn't mean we copy and paste the US system to the rest of the world, but it means that we can assist other places in the world to drastically improve their productivity rate without depleting natural resources and without endangering things such as animal welfare, animal health, food safety, and so forth. I do spend a lot of time in China, or at least I did before COVID hit and before the African swine fever hit. And I always found that amazing. The Chinese produce half of the world's pigs. They always did before African swine fever hit. And the data I'm showing you here are from before African swine fever hit their country. So they produce a total of 1 billion pigs per year in that country. But what I find more staggering than that is that the Chinese, who are very efficient today, have a pre-weaning mortality of 400 million pigs per year, meaning the Chinese have a pre-weaning mortality of 40%, 40. Can you imagine that? A 40% mortality, pre-weaning mortality on your farm would be crippling, but it is the reality there. And this is China, a pretty modern country. In most of the developing world, so third world countries, productivity is even worse than that. I mean, mortality is worse than that. Productivity is dismal. And that is actually the reason why the livestock environmental footprint globally is high, because in most developing countries, efficiencies are dismal. And that is true for beef, it's true for dairy, it's true for pigs, it's true for all the others. If we want to reduce the environmental footprint of livestock globally, we have to work with developing countries because their populations grow, because their disposable income increases, and with more disposable income, they want more animal source foods. And that increase in animal source food demand should not be satisfied through growing herds, but through better efficiencies. And we will continue to be one of the role models throughout the world because nobody rivals what we are doing here. There's some people who say, well, yeah, I mean, you have shown progress in the way we produce food, but maybe we are eating too much animal source foods anyhow. I want to show you two slides on that. The first one is this one. It shows the years 1909 until 2015, and it shows here in red beef. You can see beef consumption in the United States has remained very stable. Total red meat actually has gone slightly down over the last 100+ years. But it's true that we're consuming more meat. But what it is that we are consuming much more of is actually chicken meat. So we are consuming 500% more chicken meat. You see the green here has drastically increased. But overall, the rest of the meats have remained pretty stable. I find that really interesting. This slide here is a little convoluted, and I walk you through it. So we first start here on the left. In 2016, the USDA said that we on average eat about 5.8 ounces of meat per day in the United States. The dietary guidelines for the United States recommends that we eat 5.5. So we do eat 5.8. We should eat, according to the dietary guidelines, 5.5. Now there are these two graphs. The first on the left side is a graph for protein intake by males. On the right side, protein intake by females. On the x-axis, you see the years of those males and or females from little kids, 1 to 3 years of age until seniors. And you can see here these blue columns, and that is the range of protein that's recommended. Okay, from here, a little kid is recommended to eat between 2 to 4 ounces of protein. And then you see these orange dots, and these orange dots are the actual intake by these respective age groups. So you can see that in the United States, the average intake of the various groups here are well within the recommended ranges. Certainly not above the recommended range, except for 3 of the male groups. The middle age groups consume slightly more than what's recommended. On the female side, you will see that most female age groups consume protein at the lower recommended range. I think this is counterintuitive. Most people would think, nah, we eat way too much meat, way too much protein in this country. But that is not really what the data shows. And this data is not just some data. It is one of the most trusted data sources called NHANES. You see it here cited at the bottom. So the notion that never before have we eaten more meat and we're eating way more than we should and so on is not really reflected by the data that we see. Now, my second to last slide. Can we eat our way out of climate change? Now, a lot of the media that we consume want to make the consumers believe that that is happening, that we can actually change what we eat and by doing so, change our impact on climate. So some of my colleagues looked into what would happen if an omnivore, somebody who eats everything, would switch to a vegan diet. And I want to preface this. I really have no beef with vegans, okay? They can eat whatever they want. To me, a food choice is as much a personal choice as the religious choice, as the partner choice, as the party choice, and so on. This is none of my deal. I'm just using some vegan references here to show what the extreme would do. So if we were to go from being an omnivore to being a vegan, that would reduce our carbon footprint by 0.8 tons per year. Contrast that to a transatlantic flight per passenger, which would cause 1.6 tons of greenhouse gases. So in other words, you would have to go vegan for 2 years to offset one flight you do to Europe. Okay, so whether that's a lot or not is for you to decide, but that's just the general amount. Now, if the entire United States were to go meatless Monday, because that's also touted as one policy instrument that some localities like New York seem to be interested in. If the entire United States were to go meatless Monday, that would reduce our carbon footprint by 0.3%. And if the entire country were to go vegan, everybody, 330 million Americans, were to go vegan, no animal source foods whatsoever, it would reduce our nation's carbon footprint by 2.6%. Now, again, I'm not making fun of vegans. I'm just saying that is the most extreme side of things. And you can see that the reductions would be quite modest indeed. What I also find interesting, in much of the media, we hear veganism touted as a gold standard, something we should all aspire to. And I'm very critical of that. I also want to share with you, I talked to a representative of the Vegan and Vegetarian Society in this country, and we had a good talk, a long talk. And at the end of the talk, I asked him, so in your opinion, what is the greatest challenge your association has? And he said to me, the greatest challenge by far is the so-called retention rate. And I asked him, what is the retention rate? And he said the retention rate is the rate of people who stick with being vegetarian and vegan for longer than 1 year. And he said 84% of vegetarians and vegans who try this dietary form out for a year stop after a year. 84% do it for only 1 year. And I said, if that were true, then that would mean that for every one active vegetarian and vegan in the United States, there were 5 former vegetarians and vegans. And he said, yes. So the reason why I show you this is because it certainly is not a gold standard. A diet that is followed by very dedicated people. I mean, you don't just do veganism on the side, okay? You have to carefully plan what you eat and how you eat it and what amounts to balance everything you need. It's not easy to do. But if you do it, then you must be very committed. But if you stop after a year, then something is missing. Is it taste? Is it nutrition? I don't know. But it certainly doesn't point to me as being the gold standard in nutrition. If you were interested in what the greatest impact of our food system is on the environment, then that would be depicted on my last slide. Here you see an average US family in front of all the food that's wasted. 40% of all the food we produce in this country, 40% of all the food produced in all developed, and 40% of all the food produced in all developing countries is wasted. And that has various reasons. Many of them are known to us for a long time, have been. But if you think about it, this is just absolutely unacceptable. This is perfectly fine food that we're not eating because it's too ugly or because it's not perfect enough. And it's going to landfills, and that is not acceptable. And I always reach across the aisle and tell people who are critical of animal agriculture, if you are really interested in reducing the environmental footprint of our food, why don't we focus on the 800-pound gorillas first? They're not interested for whatever reason. I will leave it to them, but I just wanted to share that with you because this is something that we are dealing with very actively. If you are on Twitter, follow me. GHG Guru is my handle. My center, the Clear Center, also has a Twitter handle. And we also have a blog. That's clear.ucdavis.edu/blog. There's a lot of good stuff on there. So with that, I thank you so much for your attention, and I'm happy to entertain any questions that you might have.